Hi, and welcome back to another tutorial where we will be building a user interface for our REST API. So if you're following along from the previous videos where we built out the REST API, this will look all very familiar to you. But if you're not, that's okay, you can still follow along and I'll give you a repository for you to clone and get started with. So what we learn by watching this video, you're going to learn how cookies work. You're going to learn how to make network requests from a React application. You're going to learn some basic Next.js routing. You're going to learn how to do form validation with Zod. And you're going to learn how to build forms with React Hook Form. So this is the structure that the video will take. We're going to do some minor server refactoring, where we'll add our tokens to cookies, and we will add a get current user route. Then we're going to build out the registration page. We're going to build out the login page, and we're going to make a network request to get the current logged in user. And to do all this, we're going to be using Next.js, SWR, Axios, Zod, and React Hook Form. So we have this repository here, and this is from the tutorial where we built out a REST API. So I'm going to copy the link for this repository here, and I'm going to clone it into a new project. Copy or change the name. So to clone the repository, I'm going to type git clone. I'm going to paste in the URL, and I'm going to call this one REST API with UI. Once the repository has finished cloning, I'm going to cd into it. And I'm going to open it up into a new VS Code window. So you can see here we have our server files in the root directory. I'm just going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder server. And then I'm going to move everything into the server folder. I'm going to open up a new terminal. I'm going to cd into server. And I'm going to type yarn to install all the dependencies for our server. So content. Once our server dependencies have finished installing, I'm going to type yarn dev. And remember, you need a running instance of MongoDB for the server to start. For this, so once you have your server up and running, I'm going to split my terminal here. And I'm going to make sure I'm in the root directory. I'm going to type yarn create next app. And I'm just going to call my next app UI. And then I'm going to give it a flag of -- TypeScript. And this is going to bootstrap a new next app with TypeScript. If you don't want to use TypeScript, just leave out the -- TypeScript and you can still follow along. Once the app has finished bootstrapping, you can use these commands here. So we're going to use yarn dev. I'm going to cd into UI, and I'm going to type yarn dev. And this is going to start our app on port 3000. So we can come back to our browser, and we can go to localhost port 3000. And you can see that our Next.js app loads up. Let's come back to VS Code, and I'm just going to stop that server. And I'm going to open up the UI folder, and inside of pages, I'm going to remove this API directory here because we're not going to be using that. And I'm going to install some dependencies. So I'm going to yarn add Axios, and Axios is going to be used to make our network request. We're going to use SWR, React Hook Form, which is going to be used for creating our forms, Zod that we're going to use for validation, and Hook Form / resolvers that allow us to use our Zod schema in React Hook Form. So while those dependencies are installing, I'm going to come over to Pages and I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this auth. And inside of auth, I'm going to make two files. I'm going to make one called register.tsx and I'm going to make one called login. So these are going to be our pages for logging in and registering. Because we've put them in an auth folder, they're going to be localhost port 3000/auth/login and /register. So let's start our UI up again. And let's start building out our registration form. I'm going to import from React hook form, and I'm going to import a hook called use form. And I'm just going to create the page. I'm going to say function register page. And then I'm going to export default register page. And I'm just going to return, and I'm going to return a fragment. And the first part in our fragment is going to be a form. And let's just put one item in the form for now. So I'm just going to say input. I'm going to give this a type of email and a placeholder of jane.doe@example.com. Let's come back over to our UI and make sure this page is rendering correctly. So go to localhost port 3000/auth/register. And you can see here up in the top left, we have this input here. So this page is working correctly. Let's build out the rest of our form. So I'm going to wrap all the inputs in a div. And I'm going to give this div a class name equals form element. And I'm not going to do too much styling on this form because no matter what I do, you're going to be doing something different. I can guarantee it. And I'm going to give this input a label. And the label is just going to say email. And the way that we attach the label to the input is I give this a HTML4 attribute and I say it's for email. And then I give the email input an ID of email. So let's initialize our form. So I'm going to say const, and we're going to get some properties out because useForm is going to return an object. And then I'm going to get out a property called register. Then inside of our input, I'm going to register this input with our form. So I'm going to spread the register function. And then I'm going to pass in a string that just says email. And in useForm, we're going to get some errors. And so the errors are going to be in form state. And then you're going to have an errors object. And under our input, if we have an error with our email field, we want to print it to the screen. So I'm going to add a p tag. And then I'm just going to add errors.email.message. I'm going to add a question mark here because email could possibly be null because our errors object could be empty. So if we go into styles and then open up global, I have a few styles here that I prepared earlier just to make the form a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to split my window here and then I'm going to grab my browser and I'm going to split it over here so we can see it as we go. So you can see we have an email input here. And if we add a button and we give this button a type equals submit, and I'll give it a label of submit. we can create a function here for handling the submit. So I'll say on function on submit, and on submit is going to get some values. And for now, I'm just going to console.log values. And in our form, I'm going to say on submit is equal to, and we need to get another function out of our use form, and this is going to be called handle submit. I need to pass handle submit into on submit, and as a single argument into handle submit, I need to pass the on submit function. Let's open up our console, and if we type into email and click submit, we should see the value of email appear in the console. Let's say jane.doe example.com. I'll click submit, and we have an object here. And if I expand the object, we can see values and we have email. So our form is working. If we go back to our server, I'll open up source and schemas and user schema. We can see we have this create user schema. So we have a name, email, password, and password confirm. Let's copy this schema and bring it back over to our register form. And I'm going to remove the export. And we have this body here because in Express, the payload is going to be in a body object. But that's not true for our form here. So I'm going to remove body. And then I'm going to move this .refine function to the root of our object up here. I'm going to move it down here. And we need to import all these things from Zod. I'm going to import from Zod. And we need to import object and string. So we now have our schema for our forms validation. Let's use it. So I need to import the Zod resolver. So I'm going to import an object from @hookform /resolvers/Zod. And it's going to be called Zod resolver. So the way that we can use this resolver, and there's lots of different resolvers for hook forms. There's one for Yup and all other validation libraries, or most validation libraries, I should say, probably not all. And so when we call use form, we're going to pass in an object, and I'm going to pass in a property called resolver. And then resolver is going to be our Zod resolver. And then we're going to pass in our create user schema. Let's console.log these errors. And we should see some errors appear in the console. Let's try click submit, and we can see that we get some errors here. It says name is required, password, name is required on password. That is incorrect. And confirm password is required. So this name is required here. Should be password is required. So let's try remove our email from the input and click submit. And it says not a valid email. Okay. Put a valid email in and our error disappears. So let's do this for all the other fields so we get a form that passes validation. So I'm going to copy this here, and we need one for name, one for password, and one for confirming the password. I'm going to change this to name, change the label to name. The type is just going to be text. Placeholder is going to be Jane. So, and we're going to register a field called name. And the email should be errors.name.message. For password, I'm going to change this to password. The ID is going to be password. The type is going to be password. The field that we're going to register is called password, and we're going to get the error out of password. And the placeholder, let's just give it some stars. So the field is going to be called password confirmation. So let's paste this here. Say confirm password. ID is going to be password confirmation. The type is going to be password. The placeholder, we're just going to pop these stars in. And we're going to register a field called password confirmation. And we're going to get the errors out of that same field. So let's fill in our form. So I'm going to say jane.doe@example.com with a name of Jane Doe. Password is a password. And then I'm just going to say password again. Then I click submit. And we can see that we have an empty errors object here. So that's what we would expect, or this input is valid. And if we have a look at values, you can see that we have Jane Doe, password, and password as the password confirmation. So let's add something wrong here. So I'm just going to add Jane Doe as the email, and it says not a valid email. Remove name. Try submit again. And it looks like name is not appearing. So the issue with this is that on string, we need to call a property called non-empty. And then we need to pass our message into non-empty, and we need to call it message. So I'm just going to fix all of this validation here. And now we get some validation on all the fields. So let's test our passwords not matching. So I'm going to say password, and then for confirm password, I'm just going to say password 123. Click submit. And we need to have the other properties filled in. And it says passwords do not match. So that is because we have this .refine that's asserting that both the passwords should match. So the next thing we need to do is to make a network request so we can actually register a user. But before that, I'm just going to show you a little trick here. You can see that values has an implicit type of any. But we have this schema up here, and a schema is going to match what values are. So we can infer what our values are going to be from this schema. So from Zod, I'm going to import type of, and if you watch the API tutorial, this will look very familiar to you. So I'm going to say type create user input is equal to type of, and then type of is a generic, and I'm going to say type of create user schema. So now we have an interface here that is going to match our form inputs. Let's use this type here. So use form is also generic, so we can pass in our create user input into use form. And we can also type our values here. So to make the network request, I'm going to use Axios. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios. And in our onSubmit handler, I'm going to add a try catch because we want to catch any errors that Axios encounters. I'm going to await our Axios call, which means that our onSubmit function needs to be an async function. I'm going to say axios.post. And I'm going to say /API/users. And then I'm going to pass in our values into the payload of this post request. So the issue with this is we need to send it to our server. So we could hard code the HTTP localhost port 1337 here, but that's not going to scale very well because as soon as we deploy this application, it's going to break. So instead, let's use an environment variable. So in our UI folder, I'm going to make a new file and I'm going to call this .env.local. And I'm going to make one new environment variable. And it's important in Next.js to know the difference between public and private environment variables. So we need this environment variable to be public because we need it to be accessible via the browser. So I'm going to prefix it with next_public. And then I'm going to name it. So I'm going to call it server endpoint is equal to HTTP localhost port 1337. Now, if I stop our user interface server and type yarn dev again, we should have access to this endpoint. I'm going to use our template strings and I'm going to say process.env.nextPublic server endpoint. And once we catch our error, we want to display it on the page. So I'm going to import useState from React. And I'm going to create a new property called register error is equal to useState. And I'm just going to default this to null. So register error and set register error. And if we catch the error, I'm just going to set it. It's going to be in e.message. And then we can display it on our page. I'm just going to display it in a p tag here. Let's fill in our form and open up our network panel. And I'm just going to say Jane Doe, call her Jane Doe, password, and I'm going to click submit. So we're getting some errors here, and I'll have a look in the console. And this error is saying the same origin policy disallows reading the remote resource at localhost 1337. Cause header access control origin is missing. So when you see this error, it's telling you exactly what the problem is. It's expecting our header called access control allow origin. And the value of that header should be our browser's URL. So if I have a look in our network request, you can see we're sending an options request here. And as we would expect, the options request doesn't include that header. So let's go and fix that. So I'm going to stop our server and I'm going to type yarn add pause. And then I'm going to install causes development dependency. So I'm going to say yarn add types/cause, and I'm going to store that as a development dependency. So I'm going to open up app.ts and I'm going to import cause from cause. And then we're going to use cause as some middleware. So I'm going to say app.use. I'm going to pass in cause. I'm going to execute cause and I'm going to execute it with some options. And one of the options that I'm going to execute it with is origin. So I'm just going to set this origin to config.get and I'm going to set it as origin. So we obviously need to put this origin into our config. So I'm going to open up config, defaults. We say origin is equal to HTTP localhost port 3000. So this is a security feature implemented by the browsers that says, unless the server explicitly says that you can call this endpoint, we're going to block it. So this is our server telling in the browser, yes, we expect requests to come in from this endpoint. So I'm also going to pass in another property here, and this is going to be credentials. And I'm going to set this to true because we're going to pass a header for credentials later on, and this is going to tell the browser that we're expecting that header. I'm going to restart the server with yarn dev. I'm going to come back to the browser and I try to send this network request again. And you can see that we get a 204 with no content. And if we have a look in access control, allow origin, we now have a header, and this is exactly what we want. So this will now send our post request. And if we have a look at the response, you can see here that we get our user back. So this has successfully created our user. Once we create the user, let's just redirect them back to the home page. So to redirect back to the home page, I'm just going to use Next Router. So I'm going to say import from next/router. And I'm going to import use router. Then inside of our page, I'm going to say const router equals next router, and I'll execute that. Then when we encounter our error, I'm going to say router.push. So once we successfully create a user, I'm going to say router.push, and I'm going to redirect them back to the index page. Let's make another user here. So jane.doe@example.com, jane.doe, password. And we should get an error here because Jane Doe is already registered. And you can see we get an error here and it's catching. Okay, so let's register a user that doesn't exist. I'm just going to say Jane@example. Submit. And we're redirected back to the index page. Before we make our route for logging in, I'm just going to go to the server and do a little bit of refactoring. So the first thing I'm going to do is to make a handler for getting the currently logged in user. Let's say export async function get current user. And this is going to take a request and a response. And there's going to be nothing in the request body, so we can remove this generic here. And if you remember in previous tutorials, we had some middleware here where we deserialized the user, and we had some where we could require the user. So if we add the require user middleware, we can then assume that the user is on the response object. So I'm going to call return res.send res.locals.user. And this should be our handler complete. So let's add a route for this. In my routes file, I'm going to import my handler from user controller. Then I'm going to add a route here. I'm just going to copy this one here. I'm going to make it a GET request, and I'm going to make it /API/me. We want to use this require user middleware, and we want to use the get current user handler. So if we go to this endpoint now, we should expect to see a 403. Let's go to HTTP localhost 1337/API/me. And yep, we get a forbidden error. So before we can use this, we need to log in. When we log in, we're going to get a couple of tokens back. We're going to get an access token and a refresh token. And we can see this in our create user session handler. You can see we get an access token and a refresh token. So this is all well and good, and you could store this inside of local storage if you want, and then you could attach it to every single request. I personally don't like to do that. I like to set my tokens in cookies. That way they're all handled for me, and I can guarantee that they're always sent back to the server. So to do this, I'm going to set some cookies here. And then we're going to pass those cookies when the user makes a request. So before we send the cookies back, I'm just going to call res.cookie. I'm going to set one for access token. So I'm going to call this access token. Then I'm going to pass in some properties for this cookie. So I'm going to set max age, and max age is in milliseconds. And this is the milliseconds for 15 minutes. I'm going to say HTTP only. And this means that the cookie can only be accessed via HTTP. You cannot access this cookie with JavaScript. And this is a really good security feature that you get with cookies that you don't get with local storage. I'm going to set the domain to localhost. Obviously, when you use this in production, you want to be able to change this domain. So you should probably set this in config. I'm going to set the path to /. I'm going to set same site to strict. And I'm going to set secure to false. So in production, you want to set secure to true. So you want to have a flag here that says is production, then it's equal to true, otherwise it's false. And this just means that the cookie can only be used over HTTPS, where we have it set to false because our client is using HTTP. So let's copy this here for the refresh token. So I'm going to call this cookie here refresh token. And I'm going to change its max age because our refresh token is set to 1 year. So I'm going to set it to this number here, which is 1 year in milliseconds. So this all looks very good. Let's have a look in our middleware, and I'll go to deserialize user. And you can see here that we're sending a new token back to the user in the headers. So we also need to set a new cookie here. I'm going to come back to our session controller. I'm going to copy this here. I've actually missed the body of these cookies here. So I have the name here, and then I have an object, and this object is settings, but I'm missing the actual cookie. So I can put that in there, and then I can do the same for refresh token. That would have been quite a big mistake. Let's copy this here. I'm going to come back to deserialize user. And when we set our header, this is also going to set another header, and this is going to have our access token in it. If the client wants to use local storage, they can because these headers are set and we're returning the new access tokens. So they'll have access to them if they don't want to use cookies. Otherwise, the client can set and use these cookies. So the last issue is that we're getting these from the request headers, but we actually need to get the cookies from the request cookies. So out of the box, Express does not pass cookies for you. You need to install some middleware. So I'm going to say yarn add cookie parser. And just like cause, I'm going to install cookie parsers types. So I'm going to say yarn add at types / cookie parser, and I'm going to install that as a development dependency. I can start the server back up again, so we have it running. So we want to be able to get the access token from the cookie or from the header. So I'm going to add another get here, and then I'm going to say or. So we're going to get this from the request, and we're going to get it from cookies.access token. Otherwise, we're going to get it from the request headers. And we're going to do the same with refresh tokens. So once we create the login page, you'll be able to see this in action. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll come back to our UI code, and in our auth folder and login, this is where we're going to create our login page. So I'm going to cheat, and I'm just going to copy the contents of the registration page. And I'm going to paste this into login. And then I'm just going to rename some stuff. I'm going to call this login page. I'm going to export it as login page. We don't need a password confirmation field, so we can remove that. We do need a password field, so we can keep that. We don't need name, and we do need email. So that looks good. The route that we're going to hit is /API/sessions. And we're not going to use create user input. We're going to use a different schema. So if we come over to our source folder, we can find in our schemas a session schema, and we have this create session schema. So let's copy that. And I'm going to replace this schema here. And like we did before, I'm going to remove the body portion of the schema. And then I'm going to create a input type with it. And we can replace these interfaces here. We also need to replace the schema in our Zod validation resolver. Our error here, we can call this login error. And we can call this set login error. We can change the paths here. So we also need to change our validation here to be non-empty. I'm going to change these. I'm going to cut out our message from here and paste it into our non-empty. And I'm going to do the same for password. So this looks good. Let's come back over to our login page. So I'm going to say /auth/login. And we have a login form here. Let's say jane.doe@example.com. And we created this user with the password of password. Let's put this in. I'm going to click submit. And then if we have a look at our network requests, we can see what happened. So we sent an options request, and our options request was successful. And so we sent our post request with our email and password. And in our response, we got an access token and a refresh token, as we would expect. So you can see we have some headers here to set a cookie. We have access token, and we have access token here, and then we have refresh token. So if we look in the storage section, and I'm using Firefox, if you're using Chrome, this is actually in a different section. In cookies, you can see that we have no cookies. I also have this extension up here called Cookie Editor, and it also indicates that we have no cookies. So figuring out why cookies aren't being set is possibly one of the most annoying errors to try debug. And it's something that I've debugged a lot in the past. And the only method that I can give you to debug errors like this is to try different options. So when we set the cookie, try a bunch of different options in there. And then when you create the network request to get the cookie, try some options in there. In this case, the problem is that we're not setting with credentials to be true. So let's come back to /auth/login, and we'll give this another shot. And say jane.doe@example.com, password. Inspect our network requests. So with credentials needs to be the last option. The first option is the body of the request, and then the last option is the options for the Axios request. Let's try this for a third time. I'm going to click submit. And you can see here we've made a post request, we get our tokens back. So let's go make a network request to get the currently logged in user. So I'm going to come back to API, and I'm just going to make this network request on the index page. So I'm going to remove the contents of this index page. So remove the footer, the main, and the head. And I'm going to import SWR from SWR. And I'm going to create a utility for doing the fetching. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll call this utils. And inside of utils, I'm going to create one called fetcher.ts. So SWR doesn't actually do any fetching for you. You need a fetcher function to do that. SWR is going to handle the loading and error and data states for you. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios, and we're going to use Axios to do the actual fetching. Let's say const fetcher is equal to, and this is going to take a URL parameter, which is going to be a string, and it's going to return axios.get, and we're going to get our URL. We're going to get it with credentials set to true. And this is going to make sure that our cookies are sent along with the request. And I'm going to call .then. And Axios is going to return with a response. So I'm going to say res. And then we just want the data out of the response. So I'm going to say res.data. And this is our fetcher function complete. So I'm going to export default fetcher and come back to index. And I'm going to use this fetcher function along with SWR to get our user. So I'm going to say const, and SWR is going to return an object. I'm going to say equals use SWR. And this should be called use SWR because this is actually a hook. And the endpoint that we're going to use is our environment variable that we set before for the server path. So I'm going to say process.n.nextPublic server endpoint. And it's going to be /API/me. So this is going to hit the endpoint that we set up earlier. So I'm going to have data. So I'm just going to say, please log in. And then if there is data, so if data, then I'm going to assume the user is logged in. So I'm just going to return a div that just says welcome. And then I'm going to JSON.stringify the data for now so we can see what the payload is. The next thing we need to do is to pass fetcher to use SWR. So I'm going to add fetcher, and VS Code is not, and VS Code is going to import that for me. So let's come back to our index page, and I'm going to refresh. And we're getting a 403 error here. So let's have a look and see if we can find this error in the console. And we're sending along an access token. So let's try to debug this error. So I'm going to come over to deserialize user. I'm going to console log out our access token. And I'm just going to make sure that this is coming to the server correctly. I'll refresh the page. And access token is an empty string. So before we installed cookie parser, but we never actually used it. So our access token is obviously just going to be an empty string here. Let's fix that by using our cookie parser middleware. So I'm going to import cookie parser from cookie parser. We're just going to say app.use cookie parser. And it's that simple. Let's try this again. Refresh our page, and you can see we get an access token here, and we have our data on the page here. So this looks good. I'm just going to remove this console log because that could get quite annoying. So we probably just want to log the user's name. So let's just say data.name. And you can see here, data is type of unknown. So we know what our data interface should look like. It should look like a user. Let's create this user interface. And then we can use this in SWR. I can type user. And you can see here now data is typed as in it's our user. .name. You can see here that TypeScript is complaining. So it's saying promise unknown, which is coming from our fetcher, is not assignable to parameter, read only, and it's complaining here because we have user. So let's make our fetcher a generic function. So I'm just going to say t, and this is going to return a promise with t. And then our get also needs to return t. And this will keep TypeScript happy. So there's one little issue here. If we refresh the page here, you can see that it only loads me on the client, and we see the please login flash up. So we want to render this on the server. So to do this in Next.js, we're going to create a function called get server-side props. So I'm going to say export async function get server-side props. I'm going to say const data equals, I'm going to call that fetcher function. And then I'm going to paste in the URL. So this is going to fetch our data on the server, and then we can populate use SWR with this data. Then I'm going to return an object, and I'm going to say props. And then I'm going to say fallback data is equal to data. Then when we come up to here, we're going to have fallback data in our props. And then in use SWR, we can chuck it a third parameter here called fallback data. Let's clear out a network request here. Refresh the page. And it says fallback data is a promise. So we need to await this fetcher here. Let's try this again. So we're getting a 403 error here when we try fetch the user server side. And that's because when we fetch the user server side, we're not passing along the headers. It's actually the next server that's making the request. So let's fix that. So I'm going to change this get server side props to a constant. So export const get server side props equals async function. And then we can type this properly. So I can type this as get server side props, and this is imported from Next. Then we're going to get context. Then our headers are going to be in context.request.headers. So we need to pass these headers along to our fetcher function. So let's pass them in here as a second argument. And then we can open up fetcher and we can say headers. And we're just going to default this to an empty object. And then we can pass headers onto our fetcher function here. So I just need to fix my arrow function there. Let's save this and refresh to try out our get me function. You can see that it loaded up the user and it didn't load the please log in text before we saw the user. So this is all being fetched server side. So before we finish up, let's fix the types here for fallback data. So I'm going to use the next page generic here, and I'm going to say that fallback data is of type user. And I just want to show you one problem that can happen. So let's clear out our cookies. And then I'm going to refresh.